What's wrong with decrying America for systemic racism? And why does it make white Americans feel so good to condemn themselves as so bad when it comes to race? And why have the standard solutions to the hardships of America's Black communities, like the Great Society, public housing, and affirmative action, how come those have done more for white psyches than for Black lives? We will explore these questions and more on today's episode of Independent Conversations. Thanks so much for joining us, everybody. I'm Graham Walker, coming to you from the Independent Institute here in Oakland, California. We're just across the bay from San Francisco, and we aim to give you a kind of independent outlook on the events of our era. And today, we're going to tackle some of these tough questions with the help of noted literary scholar and cultural analyst, Dr. Shelby Steele. Welcome, Dr. Steele.
Thank you. Good to be here.
It's a thrill to have you, really. People probably know of you, but for those who don't know some of the pithy pieces, let me just remind folks that Dr. Steele is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, written often for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Harper's. I guess you're still a contributing editor at Harper's, is that right?
I believe so.
Lucky them. You won the National Book Critics Circle Award for your book, The Content of Our Character, A Vision of Race in America. You won a Bradley Foundation Prize for Outstanding Achievement. Your PhD is in English from the University of Utah, if I've got that right. And boy, you have a number of other books, such as not only the one I mentioned, but 2007, White Guilt, How Blacks and Whites Together Destroyed the Promise of the Civil Rights Era. Another one, 2014, A Bound Man, Why We Are Excited About Obama and Why He Can't Win. So
I got that one right.
and a bunch of others. So you've been pretty busy on the score for a long time, haven't you?
I guess so. Now that you mention it, yeah.
I mean, as a literary scholar, people might wonder, well, how did you start thinking about race in America if your whole thing was literature? And I think somehow there are connections that are not obvious to me on the surface, right?
Yeah, there are connections. It's race is a human problem. Literature studies race. It examines it, shows us how human beings get caught in these dilemmas and what motivates people and so forth. So for me, it was a sort of natural coming together of things. Literature still is my default intellectual interest.
Mm-hmm. That makes a lot of sense. I was wondering, as I was looking at your long history of intellectual production, whether it was a shame that you got pulled away from the study of literature, but you didn't entirely get pulled away, because as I look at your most recent work, this remarkable documentary film, What Killed Michael Brown, there's a concept of poetic truth, which we're going to come back to in a minute, but I have a feeling that came to you through your literary insights.
Yes. It involves the concept of license with language and reality, and I have found that in thinking about race to be extremely useful.
You were pretty much involved in the civil rights movement and the war on poverty back in maybe the 70s. Can you tell us a little bit about what you did in those days that kind of got your career going and got you thinking?
Well, I have to say I grew up in a family. My mother and father met as founding members of CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, back in the early 40s. And so I was a CORE baby. I grew up in the civil rights movement, and my family, every night they were at meetings, and we were at marches on the weekend, and so I remember when Martin Luther King was just a newcomer, and we wondered if he'd really work out. So that is sort of the world I came out of. I read a good deal about it, and had certain heroes as a kid: James Baldwin, Malcolm X, others. Eldridge Cleaver was a great writer, one of the first class writers, I think, of that era. And so the involvement just continued all the way through high school through college. I was founded the civil rights group on my campus at Little College in Iowa, Coe College, and continued in that way. And I say indulged in the Black Power movement for a good little while, and sort of examined that as a point of view, as a way to look at America. I sort of worked for years in government programs, war on poverty programs.
You were in East
St. Louis.
St. Louis. Yeah. Tell us just briefly about East St. Louis.
Yeah. Quite an experience. So it's always been something I've been engaged with, and traveled a good little bit in Africa. I'm very interested in Africa. Some of my first publications were on the literature that began to come out of Africa in the late 60s and all the way up to today, where it's now prolific and international.
Your father was quite a remarkable character. He was, I think, the son of a man who had been born into slavery. Your grandfather, have I got that right?
My grandfather was born in slavery, yes.
And then your father lost both his parents when he was a very small boy.
Right. He was about 12 when his when his father died. Excuse me, he was 8 when his father died. He was 12 when his mother died.
Wow.
And had to make it on his own pretty much from that point on. Again, he had many siblings, but he was the youngest, and they were in as bad or worse shape than he was. So he was pretty much on his own from the time he was 12.
Made his way to Chicago on his own.
Made his way to Chicago. It took him 6 months to get from Kentucky to Chicago. And that didn't work out. He first went to Detroit, and then that didn't work out. Then he ended up in Chicago, where he spent pretty much the rest of his life. And that's where I was born.
Hardworking man.
Very hardworking man, determined. I can't, get emotional. I can't talk enough about him. I was lucky. I don't think I'll ever be in his league as simply as a human being. He truly was marvelous, and people who knew him knew that. And he was enormously respected in our community. As was my mother, along with him. She too was a remarkable woman. My father had a 3rd grade education. My mother had a master's degree from the University of Chicago. She was white.
Oh my! That was quite a pair.
Quite a pair, and I can't say enough about either one of them. They both were truly remarkable people. But together they did things. The school I went to was segregated and horrible and abusive to Black children. And both my parents organized all the other parents. They boycotted that school. They ultimately got rid of the superintendent, the principal, several teachers.
Wow.
Rebuilt, built another school, all as a kind of outgrowth of this commitment to civil rights and equality. And so forth. They caught hell for it. They were pilloried in the Chicago Sun-Times and other newspapers, but they were the two strongest people I've ever known.
Something happened to the civil rights movement, or maybe not to the civil rights movement, but to those who claimed the legacy and the mantle of it. And you were totally on board with the civil rights movement, but the heirs of the movement today who advocate systemic racism and so forth, you seem to be kind of a nemesis of that group. How different your perspective must be from what you thought it was going to be when you were younger.
Yes, it's a little heartbreaking to be honest about it. We won the civil rights. There's certain tools that groups have when they come out of oppression. We came out of oppression in the 1960s. We won a civil rights bill, Voting Rights Act, open housing law. America said we were wrong, and we may not do it perfectly, but we're going to try. Things turned around. at that moment, we as Blacks became challenged to then enter the game, enter the society, and prove ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you have been oppressed for 4 centuries, that is an extremely difficult challenge to face. It's intimidating. It causes enormous anguish, not a feeling of excitement and happiness, but, ooh, what are we going to do now? We've always relied on somebody else. That's the nature of oppression. How do we do it? One of the things groups do, I'm writing about this now, is that in situations like that, is go backward and say, no, 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 you think we're free now because of all that legislation. No, we're really, it's still here. We still have to organize that. Racism is everywhere. It's not just an isolated incident here and there. It's, excuse me, it's systemic. It's broad-based, it's invisible, but it's like the air itself for Blacks, and it holds us down. And so we need to continue to be treated as victims who are who are taken care of, who are lifted up by the larger society's desire to redeem itself from what it did to us.
Mm-hmm.
Keep that sort of symbiosis going. And so a lot of what comes out of Black America today, none of us back in the 60s foresaw this, that we would reinvent racism rather than do the harder work of attacking freedom, seizing freedom and using it. Mm-hmm. And so that's where we've, it seems to me, made a profound mistake that I'm sure we'll correct at some point.
But the cult of victimization appeals not only to those who hope to, be done right by, but also to those who feel guilty. And that is kind of how the poison of the last few decades has affected our society on race relations, if I understand your argument correctly.
Yes, that's the other side of the symbiosis, is that when America admitted to, think about it, admitting that, yeah, we truly oppressed these people for 400 years.
Terrible.
We denigrated them in every way. We dehumanized them. We debased them. All of our culture symbolism reflects our belief that they're inferior. We denigrate everything they believe in and everything they do. And then you suddenly have to admit that happened. That really, to me, that's in the sort of social cultural way, that's the biggest event in the 20th century for America, is this great, what I call great confession. Mm-hmm. We did it. And of course, President Johnson, right away launches the Great Society, the War on Poverty, Affirmative Action, school busing, public housing, expanded welfare payments, on and on and on.
Well, once you've confessed your guilt, then you have to do your restitution, and that was perhaps the psychology of the Great Society.
That's exactly right. You have to pursue redemption in some way, and so America spent, the last figure I heard of was $26 trillion since, in the 60 years since the passage of the Civil Rights Bill, on programs to uplift Blacks. And the irony, of course, is that Blacks are farther behind whites today than they were 60 years ago, when they got nothing from the government. And we're actually narrowing that gap between Blacks and whites.
Yeah, you had some data that in one of the things I saw you produced, which said that from 1947 to 1960, that the Black poverty rate dropped during that period from 87% to 47%. And there was really no Black underclass to speak of up until, the 60s got going.
That's right. The Black underclass is almost entirely the spinoff of all of this, what I call, to just sum it up in a phrase, white guilt. And I don't mean, when I say white guilt, I don't mean a feeling of guilt, of guiltiness. Some whites feel it, some don't. It's an abstract sort of idea. But white guilt is the terror of being seen as a racist.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you're seen as a racist, you lose all your moral authority. And you're weak and vulnerable in the world. And whites couldn't stand the thought of that. And so they dumped programs and favoritism and preferences and everything they could possibly dump on blacks to sort of win back the moral authority they had lost by confessing to this long history of oppression.
And those social programs then have the inadvertent effect of depriving African-American citizens of a sense of agency to the extent that they become dependent. Is that how that worked?
This is the most pernicious thing, and one of the most pernicious things in this whole story of race in America. As whites were tried to redeem themselves from this shameful racist history, in order to do that, they took responsibility for Black development away from Blacks onto themselves and said, look, you're inferior. We don't have faith that you can make yourself equal to the rest of us. We don't have faith in you. That's why we're going to give you all these programs, all racial preferences of every kind today, diversity, inclusiveness. It just never ends. The white guilt sort of taking over responsibility for Black development. So what happens in 60 years? Blacks don't develop. They get public housing, they get schools, they get all sorts, they don't develop.
It's tragic.
Because they don't see themselves, they see themselves as victims of racism rather than as people in charge of their own lives. That's the worst thing you can do, because that's what steals their humanity away. That's what dehumanizes them. And when we look at Black leaders today, they break my heart. They're just constantly in line asking for more of these sort of white guilt programs, as I call them. If we don't get more resources in the inner city, we'll never be able to compete. Well, can you get a piece of chalk and apply it to a blackboard? Then you got the resources you need to educate the children in front of you. But when you
probably
think
do
of
better
yourself
than the
as just
internet.
a victim, you think your fate is in the hands of others. Then you languish, and we're languishing now, when we should be competing.
The mindset of being a victim creates a kind of tinderbox of potential anger, of course, as well as conflict. And it was into that tinderbox that some of these recent public events, into which matches were thrown in the instance of Michael Brown's death in 2014 and then George Floyd's death last year. There was an explosion, but the explosion was made possible by this mindset of victimization and by all these sort of inadvertently harmful policies that were adopted through this process you just described. So you set out a couple of years ago to try and make sense of Michael Brown's killing, which until George Floyd seemed to be the emblematic instance of continued Black suffering at the hands of white power in America. And you've recently produced a documentary film. The title of it is?
What Killed Michael Brown?
And when did you release that? Not long ago, right?
Last fall, 4 months ago.
I had the privilege, thanks to your generosity, of viewing the whole thing yesterday for the first time. It is a remarkable film. And what I found especially helpful is that you took the incidents around Michael Brown's death, August 9th, 2014, 18-year-old young man killed by a 28-year-old white officer, Darren Wilson. Those are the bare facts of the case. You examined that and saw that the reaction to it actually illustrated all the problems you've been describing here in race relations and the psychology of white guilt. And would it be helpful, would you mind if I showed part of your trailer for that film?
No, I would not mind.
Okay, so we're going to stop and pause, and everybody joining us is going to see. My assistant is going to trigger that, and here we go.
A black boy dead in the street, shot by a white policeman.
This was an execution. This was an assassination.
It was 4.5 hours before they finally removed the body.
It's like they left the body out there as a warning for us.
To this day, there are people who blame Ferguson Market for Michael Brown's death.
I want your hands all the way up because this is how he was when he got shot, when he got assassinated, when he got executed. When everybody gets to go home, we stay black, homie.
Ferguson is a microcosm of this country.
White cop, black kid, absolutely. Race played a significant part of the reaction.
What happened in Ferguson was more about America, the very same America that would explode in 2020, where every black was George Floyd and every cop was Derek Chauvin.
You can do better next time by doing the right thing.
Since the 60s, whites have lived under the accusation that they are racist.
Ferguson really became kind of a destination city for successful African Americans.
We were not part of white flight.
No.
Some people want to be angry at someone. Michael Brown had tried to buy cigarillos the night before with pot.
He put his hands in the air, but the officer still approached with his weapon drawn, and he fired several more shots.
Some witnesses have also said that they actually saw you stand over him.
That'd be incorrect.
What did you see in that face?
Aggression. There was nothing. It was like hollow just looking through me.
What demons might have been at work within him and to make the final fateful charge against Officer Wilson? America's original sin is not slavery. It is simply the use of race as a means to power. When truth becomes the lie, and when the lie becomes truth.
If Michael Brown valued his life, he wouldn't take the chance of risking it.
Was it really racism that killed Michael Brown?
What killed Michael Brown? Wow. I mean, the bare facts were in dispute for a while, but then they weren't. The young man had been in an altercation. He had hit the police officer in the head. Is that right? And
yes.
Then he was running away from him, and then he headed back toward him in an extremely menacing way. And were his hands up while the police officer shot him, begging for mercy, or not?
Every witness says that there was not a single witness who was actually on the scene says that his hands were up. He balled up his fist and charged the policeman.
Mm-hmm.
After he had been shot once. And the policeman kept telling him, please stop. And he didn't. You have to note that Michael Brown weighed over 300 pounds. He was an extremely powerful young man. He was not as though there was no real threat. There was a threat. It was clear to everyone there that he died by provoking the policeman into a position where he had to fire out of self-defense.
Now, ultimately, even the Obama Justice Department agreed that there couldn't be charges brought against the officer, right?
The Justice Department, the FBI, 2 different grand juries investigated this case. None of them found a single shred of evidence to suggest that that there was a racial motive, that the policeman provoked it. Not one shred of evidence in 4 different thorough, because all of those investigations wanted desperately to find evidence of racism. That was their goal. But even with that, given that bias, they were unable to do so. So it became even a bigger fight And the fight in that sense, again, what I've learned over the years, people will dispute this, but it's just a life of observation, that any time people pick up the issue of race, it is in the interest of power.
Mm-hmm.
Race is nothing more, nothing less than a means to power. And so the government was looking for power. They wanted Michael to be a victim of racism. That justified 60 years of political liberalism in America, of giveaway liberalism. And so that's what they were after. That their hope riding on this young 18-year-old boy was that he would be a source of enormous power. And he was. George Floyd was. Trayvon Martin was. It has become a source of power in American life. It is touching every single institution in American life.
What's fascinating about the Michael Brown case is that even though pretty much everyone responsible acknowledged that the officer wasn't guilty of what he had been claimed of just outright racist murder, nevertheless, somehow Michael Brown had to be emblematic. People insisted that he be upheld as somehow the poetic embodiment of all this oppression, even though he himself didn't seem to fit the profile. And you said that Eric Holder, actually the Attorney General at the time under President Obama, he couldn't hold the police officer responsible, but he decided to use a different technique. You said he followed a formula of power that had been developed by Al Sharpton and others and ultimately made Ferguson pay, even though he couldn't make Darren Wilson pay. What does that mean?
Well, what it means is that people like Sharpton and so their goal, again, in their pursuit of power, and they are about really nothing more and nothing less than sheer political power. And they're in American society, race is a rich source of power. If you can find blacks who are victims and whites who are oppressors, then it seems as all these incidents seem as though America keeps duplicating its old sickness of white racism and black victimization. And therefore, because I'm on the side of the black victim, power should redound to me. So President Obama and Eric Holder entered the whole Ferguson mess in pursuit of power. No doubt they won some of that power. Whites were really on the defensive, and even though the truth was on their side, they lost the argument.
Mm-hmm.
And we now today, a few years later, are asked to accept that racism in America is not isolated incidents, but is systemic, is prolific, is everywhere. And Michael Brown and Trayvon Martin and Freddie Gray and any number of other young blacks killed by white policemen are evidence of this systemic racism. Why do we want racism to be systemic? Because it's power.
Mm-hmm.
And systemic racism, under the flag of systemic racism, I can demand that corporate America change its ways. I can demand that professional football allow this. I can that universities transform themselves in this way. That churches, any institution in American life, I now have the power to get those institutions to change, and they all will, because none of them want to be seen as racist. They have white guilt.
Mm-hmm.
And so white guilt, this is the symbiotic bond here, the sort of sick tie. And it's completely injuring America, because the objective truth that Michael Brown was exhausted. Every drug known was in his body. He had been in 4 high schools in 4 years. He was from a broken home. His father was abusive, on and on. Those things have nothing to do with his death. What had to do with his death was that there was a white policeman who was a racist. Well, if that's America, and that's what the political left points to in America today, and that is an extremely powerful point of view.
That symbiosis of guilt and power generated the support for the multi-trillion dollars you just mentioned a few moments ago. Among other things, we've mentioned the Great Society, public housing, for example. You said at one point that the new liberalism, as opposed to the old liberalism, the new liberalism coming out of the 1960s created the world that killed Michael Brown, and it was always more about assuaging white guilt than developing blacks. So, for example, you told us in this documentary, which I highly recommend our viewers watch, that St. Louis had a thriving black aspiring community and black middle-class community. There was a high level of home ownership, as high as white neighborhoods, but it didn't look good, and whites were feeling guilty, and so public housing was decreed. The neighborhoods were bulldozed. Instead was put up these horrible concrete monoliths, notoriously known as the Pruitt-Igoe projects, and many, many others like them around the United States. The Pruitt-Igoe, of course, project has the particular appeal of having been had to be dynamited. Was it finally in the 1980s? I think it was dynamited.
70s.
In the 70s, because it had become such a horrible infestation of degradation for its inhabitants. But you have argued that public housing was a form of socialism, which created the very damaging conditions that supposedly it was to make up for. How did that work?
Absolutely. You couldn't have done a worse thing to blacks than something about public housing. And the worst feature of public housing, like Pruitt-Igoe and Robert Taylor Homes in Chicago, where I grew up, and so forth. The terrible thing about that, again, is the government is really interested in winning back the moral authority, the legitimacy, and the power that it lost when it confessed to 4 centuries of racism. And so therefore, the last thing they care about is black people. Black people are simply pawns in a scheme of white redemption. And white liberalism is about the redemption of whites in America and of the legitimacy of our government.
But specifically redemption through the creation of programs that deploy power to control economic resources for the ostensible good of the recipients, but their actual harm.
That's right. Because when they took over the housing that blacks had in St. Louis, very much like the housing I grew up in, my father was a part of, was created entirely by blacks. It was really a transition neighborhood. They were on their way up. The minute the Civil Rights Bill passes, the government jumps in, says, no, you'll live here in this beautiful high-rise we've built for you. The evil, the pernicious aspect of that was white America said to black America, we have no faith that you can agent your own overcoming. We have no faith in anything about you except your inferiority. We believe liberalism is based on a deep faith, not in black agency and self-help development, but in the myths of racism, that you're inferior and you can't do it without us. You won't, and it's unfair of us to withhold all of our vast resources from you, because if we do that, then we'll be in all sorts of we'll be guilty.
I think your point is
racist.
Your point, I think, is not that individuals and families and churches and whatnot didn't have a role to play in being charitable and helpful and so forth, but it was the centralized power of the state, which
Right.
claimed resources and redeployed them.
That's right. And you know that liberal power is at work when you see one thing. There is never, those policies, those programs never ask anything from Black people. They don't care. So I'll give you affirmative action. You can go to the university over your head. But I'm not going to ask anything from you. So affirmative action created a situation in America since the 60s where Blacks in universities have the lowest grade point average and the highest dropout rate of any student group in America, because they were brought there and stuffed onto the campus as examples of white innocence, not of Black greatness, not of Black overcoming, but of how good white people are. And how innocent they are, and how they deserve to stay in power. And so it's white guilt is ingenious.
It's absolutely ingenious. Now we're getting a whole new cycle of it in the wake of George Floyd and so forth, that the insistence upon white guilt and whites are now, and others, especially white Americans, seem to be driven by a compulsion to denounce themselves and to denounce the whole system of private property and free exchange, the constitutional order. It's all to be trashed. The more vociferous they are about trashing it, the more righteous they feel, I guess. And if you don't mind, I actually have prepared this one clip that I found especially telling on this point about white guilt and the kind of parasitical or symbiotic relationship. I'm going to play this little clip from your video. Starts right here.
By implication, all of white America stood accused. The power here was literally enormous. Whites around the entire Western world hit the streets in protest against this murder. These whites seem to say, as an anti-racist, I am guilty of racism. But this confession of guilt, as with all whites, past and present, is also their proclamation of racial innocence. Black lives matter! 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 This desperation among whites for innocence of racism often presses America into bad faith solutions to racial problems.
It's time to end the American experiment and then start all over again.
I think that we have to burn it down.
Do you think it's time to end the American experiment?
Yes.
This was the desperation that fueled the liberalism of Pruitt-Igoe. The war on poverty, affirmative action, school busing, diversity this and diversity that. This grab for entitlements continues to this day. These programs give white America moral legitimacy, or at least the illusion of it, even as they utterly fail to help the Black underclass.
These programs give white America moral legitimacy, or at least the illusion of it, even as they utterly fail to help the Black underclass. I don't know if anyone in America is saying this besides you.
Well, thank you.
Well, I guess it needs to be said.
Not that I'm happy to say it.
No, I mean, I wish it weren't the case. But yeah. You know, the more you think about it, the more you realize there is this profound compulsion driving the self-denunciation of masses of people.
Yeah.
You, of course, it's an inner compulsion, but it's also an external compulsion, because if you don't, fly the flag of self-condemnation, fly the flag of anti-racism, then you might be accused of racism. And then you might lose your job or, one thing or another.
Right.
What a strange social psychology.
Yeah. Well, it is interesting, but the threat of stigmatization as a racist is one of the most powerful weapons certainly is Black leadership in America lives and dies by this kind of a weapon, this ability to manipulate white guilt. And the left in America uses the term racism and racist as though everybody in the world qualifies. And we can sort of, it's so bad, we can see them doing it. We can see the manipulation, but they do it anyway, and it works anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And no whites just simply are in this, history has put them in a situation, circumstance that is undermining what is the broader culture. Because if what terrifies me about white guilt is that it weakens the ability of white Americans to stand up for the principles that made America great in the first place. The principles that led us finally to end slavery, that led us finally to pass civil rights legislation. But again, if whites now would have this sort of gun to their head, and people just sort of shake them down and get all sorts of little goodies, and because after all, America's a wealthy country, and so we can afford literally to give away a lot of things, and we do.
We can afford the luxury of insisting upon policies which will harm the intended beneficiaries and benefit ourselves.
That's right. And benefit ourselves. That's exactly right.
You said at one point the civil rights movement was a good faith movement and BLM is a bad faith movement. That's not going to make you a popular character. What did you mean by that?
Well, I meant that Black Lives Matter is naked manipulation of white guilt. It has nothing to do with the development of Black America, which continues to be underdeveloped, and that underdevelopment gets worse every day. What does BLM do? They chase down white people to shake them down. They're thugs. That's what they are. They don't speak for me. I don't have any doubt about Black lives mattering or white lives mattering or Asian lives and so forth. You're raising what I call poetic truth, an illusion of racism that is systemic and so forth, because you're basically, excuse my word, you're pimping it. You're selling it to, that Americans are afraid for their own innocence. They're afraid, they're insecure morally around race. And you go into that crack of insecurity, mm-hmm. and you light a match.
Wow.
And they give you things. They say, put the match out, please. And they give you things, and they let you kneel at the football game, and they give you another government program, another diversity, and the terminology of the movement escapes me at the moment, or maybe I just don't want to dignify it by expressing it. But that's what Black Lives Matter is about. It's shaking down white people. Most Black people have a very jaundiced view of that organization, because they say to themselves, I grew up when there was real racism. What are you talking about? Your obligation, given what came before, the sacrifices that came before you, is to make something of yourself as an individual. That's your contribution to the race.
That's everybody's obligation to the common good. It's not a group
That's
thing
right.
or a race thing at all. We all have that obligation to make the most of what God has given us, and to benefit others, according to our ability.
Yeah.
Ourselves. Yeah. You have, what you've hit on is that the human psyche is driven by poetry in a certain sense. That is to say, there's this poetic construction about Black victimization and white guilt, which profoundly, it has enough elements of truth to be appealing, but it has a poetic mystique, and people respond to the poetry rather than to the facts, and they get a lot of satisfaction out of responding to the poetry. Both sides of the equations get satisfaction out of the poetry rather than the truth.
Right.
I thought that people are supposed to be driven by self-interest, but you say they're driven by this kind of strange psychic poetry.
Well, it is because poetry gives you the illusion of illumination and emotional connection. Oh, now I am illuminated by the truth. My parents, those old fogies who come from the earlier era, who didn't have the advantage, they're stuck. But I'm illuminated by this truth, that there is such a thing as systemic racism, that it's around every corner, that every Black who wakes up in the morning is simply beset by a society that holds him in contempt, that wants to beat him down. I believe that sort of dark story, that dark poetry, because it puts me it makes me a redeemer.
Mm-hmm.
It puts me on the side of redemption. I'm going to save those people, as long as they admit that they're weak and helpless and that they need me.
Right.
The slave owners did not go that far. The white segregationists did not nearly go that far. They didn't take over your soul and say you have to be an inferior being in order to justify us, for us to justify ourselves. They didn't do that. We were better off with the segregationists I grew up with. I could talk to them, and they didn't give me an inch. The segregation, they said, well, what can we do about it? It's God's will. Everybody wants to be with their own kind. Too bad for you.
Wow. Well, you quoted Robert Woodson at one point in your film saying bigotry is external, but being patronized is internal. I think that's kind of what you're saying now.
Exactly. Yes. Woodson said it very well.
One is actually, you're saying, and he's saying, more corrosive than the other. Even though it may be wrapped up in all sorts of platitudes and mea culpas and self-denunciations, the patronizing may be more corrosive than the bigotry.
It's so bad. We're in a situation at this moment in American history where Blacks are asking their own people to believe in their victimization rather than in their freedom. That's where we're at today.
Mm-hmm.
And so we get nowhere. Years go by. How many more Black kids need to be shot? It goes on and on, because our own leaders, our own people insist that you see us as victims, and that we think of ourselves as victims who cannot make it unless someone else comes in and does it, engineers us, agents us, into a better life, a better way of living. We can't do it. So the one thing Black people need now is self-possession.
Everybody needs that.
And that's the one thing America still won't give it, because now, in order to give Black people self-possession, white America would have to say what Frederick Douglass wanted them to say 150 years ago: leave us alone. Frederick Douglass had it so right: leave us alone. Because you'll come in here and you'll take possession of our problems in our life. And next thing I know, you want me to be a victim. And I've got to go around in this wealthy, free society where there's only a shred of racism left. I know, I grew up in it. And act as though racism is still a profound problem for me. No, the problem for me is that I don't know, haven't had experience with freedom.
So
don't know how to deal with it.
In order to concede to others a sense of their own agency and self-responsibility, those on the dominant side, in this case maybe the white side, what they would have to relinquish something to concede that power, that freedom, that agency to others. They'd have to relinquish all these things which give them the gratification that they crave of being anti-racist, non-racist, assuaging their white guilt. They don't want to give that up. They would rather keep their clients in place than relinquish the gratification of assuaging their white guilt. Is that how it goes?
Absolutely. That's how it goes. They're saying, I need my innocence more than I need you to do well.
Right. Yeah.
I'm not even going to ask you to do well because I don't have the moral authority to do that.
Right.
So we're at a terrible sort of stalemate there.
Okay, so we've got loads of questions coming in from people watching with us here today. Some of them I've asked the questions myself, sort of in my own words. Simple question coming in. So I take it you're not keen on critical race theory, Dr. Steele. True?
Critical race theory is a wonderful example of what I'm talking about. It expands victimization. It says that when you demand for something from the larger society, that you don't even have to explain it or justify it. You just should be given this and be given. So it escalates the symbiosis that's already in place by keeping whites in charge and blacks again in the position of having their hand out begging in the name of their victimization. So it is an ugly, demeaning, dehumanizing ideology. But again, it is supported in a society that lacks the moral authority to look its people in the eye and say, stop it. Mm-hmm. You know better than this. Mm-hmm. You know better than this. You don't want to you wouldn't raise your own children by giving them this kind of license to indulge in the notion of themselves as victims. As parents, what do we do is say, you may be victimized, but you're going to have to do this anyway. That's the nature of life, buddy. Grow up.
That's actually love.
That's absolutely love.
Mm-hmm.
I love my people. I am so proud.
I can see that.
What other people have survived 4 centuries of brutal dehumanization. Have produced in 1 century, 20th century, one of the great literatures of the world, have transformed music across the face of this earth.
Mm-hmm.
Black America. I'm extremely proud, and that is why I challenge my people. It's time for us to forget about racism and think about freedom. Become doers, not beers.
You're not the first. Back in the, I guess, 60s and 70s, remarkable man named T.R.M. Howard. We published a book last year by Independent Institute here called T.R.M. Howard, a doctor, entrepreneur, civil rights pioneer. You read this when it first came out. He was an interesting example of a man who took freedom seriously and was responsible for himself and his own people and community, and he didn't want the government to do it.
Absolutely.
Highly recommended book.
Yeah, I came along before the passage of the Civil Rights Bill, and those were the kind of men I knew. Those were the kind of men who were involved in the Civil Rights Movement. Blacks were total self-respect, wanted total responsibility for our own fate, created Black colleges, Black medical schools,
Black banks,
Black businesses of every kind. And we gave all that up on the promise by white America that they needed to redeem themselves more than help us develop.
Mm-hmm.
And we're still stuck there. So now Blacks are out here undeveloped. No, the Black family is all but destroyed. 75% of Black children are all born out of wedlock. How do you get out of a spot like that?
Mm-hmm.
And we think the answer is to just keep squeezing nickels and dimes out of white America.
Mm-hmm. Here's another question that fits right in, I'm afraid to say. Dr. Steele, what do you think about reparations and California Governor Gavin Newsom's task force to study and make recommendations on reparations for slavery?
I don't think he'll have me on his task force.
I don't think so.
for one thing. There's no such thing as reparations. Here's one thing that I want to try to remember to get in. There's no such thing as reparations. White America, what's my challenge to white America? White America at some point is going to have to accept itself for what it is. White America did, in fact, in earlier times, commit arguably the worst instance of human oppression ever. There's nothing you can do today, no program you can create, no reparations that you can come up with that are going to get rid of that. They're going to erase that from history. It is a part of history. It is also true that the Western world has created arguably the greatest civilization ever. That's also true. What whites must understand, you, like all people, are fallen. You have within you the capacity to do evil things. If you're a human being, all human beings do. None of us escape that. We have to grow up, which means we accept that we have these dark potentialities within us. Racism is a reflex. Boom. It presents itself before you have time to defend yourself against it. There it is. We need to know that and watch out for it. And in our struggle to be better human beings, we will make progress. We will let other people make progress. We will get ahead. We can't, it's a fantasy to think you can buy your way out of 4 centuries of oppression. You can't. They don't have enough affirmative action programs. They don't have enough reparations. All you're doing is perpetuating the illusion that you can give somebody what's been taken away. You can't.
And perpetuating that illusion is highly gratifying to the majority community. And even if it involves inflicting further damage on the intended recipients, it still is highly gratifying to the dominant community. They won't give up their Pruitt-Igoes, their diversity things, their affirmative action stuff. They won't give it up because it's too satisfying.
Yeah.
So, if I'm a white American, I need to relinquish my insistence that I've got to expiate through government policy and instead let people go back to being people.
Yeah, that's right. And when you see me coming, the worst thing you can possibly do is lower standards. I'm pro-Black. Therefore, I believe American institutions, when it comes to admitting people to them, when you see a Black person come, you should raise the standards.
That doesn't sound fair.
You should raise the standards.
I heard you. Here's a simple...
And nobody will believe I'm equal until you do.
I'm afraid that's the way human psychology is, regardless of race.
That's the way the world works.
It's the way the world works, yeah. Maybe this is close to the final question here. How do we affect cultural change in impoverished communities? Do we need to adjust America's political economy to help raise the floor, or do we need a more local approach, or what? What can we do to improve all this mess? Shelby Steele?
The problem is in your use of the word we.
Mm-hmm. Precisely.
Meaning implying, no doubt, white America.
Or the government.
Or the government. What we need to do is to get out of the way of those people. We need a society that's fair, that does not discriminate against people on the basis of their race. We need that desperately. If we don't have that, we have nothing. But after that, we must leave people alone. I have faith in Black people. I know they can do it. I know they can find a way to do it. Again, my father had a 3rd grade education. He had 4 children, all of them had PhDs. He never got a dime from the government, from white guilt. And that's the attitude, that's where Black pride, it seems to me, comes in. Black pride will save us if it enables us to stop putting our lives in the hands of other people. You take care of yourself, I'll take care of myself. And that's the way it ought to be.
I know some millennial-aged young people who have really good hearts, and they might well be listening. Some of them may be watching right now. And I just imagine some of them saying to themselves, but Dr. Steele, shouldn't we be advocating for social justice after all? Isn't that a good thing to do? Social justice, after all, is social justice.
We have the least racially the least racist society in the history of the world. I grew up when there was rank racism everywhere. Every aspect of my life was curt. I'll be here all day if I go down the litany of what racism did, what I saw it do. I'm telling you, we're free today. Black people can do anything they want, including be the president, including be the CEO of a major corporation. They can be a great opera singer. They can make the best rap music. They can do anything. They're no different than anybody else. They're just the same. They're no better, they're no worse. We have to stop treating them as a special case, because that's not what it's about. They're not a special case. It's you, the white America, that wants them to be a special case so you can throw nickels and dimes at them and make yourself feel like you're a great person. You're for social justice. No, you're not. You are for the continued oppression of Black people.
Through the mechanisms and policies now designated social justice.
Right.
Yeah,
that's exactly right.
It's pretty ironic. It's remarkable to have a chance to talk to you about these things, Dr. Steele. Thank you on behalf of all of our participants around the country who've tuned in. It's been pretty amazing. And if they want to watch What Killed Michael Brown, what do they do?
It's on Amazon. It's on Salem, I think right now. It's you should watch out for it. It's going to soon be on many other platforms as well. But it's been on Amazon for a good while now.
And you can look at
canceled it to begin with.
Did they really?
Yes, they did.
Oh man, how'd you overcome that?
People, the Wall Street Journal took a position on it, and so out of nowhere we got a phone call that said, "We're sorry, we made a mistake."
So they thought that it was somehow unacceptable?
They thought it was unacceptable.
To contest the poetic...
And it was a nasty letter, and they basically said, they told us not to do any tricks to try to reapply.
Oh, wow.
That there was nothing we could do. Well, luckily we got the Wall Street Journal. I write for them sometimes.
Good. Well, that sounds like Amazon.
They wrote an editorial on it, and it got picked up. And so it's been now streamed on Amazon for about 4 months.
It sounds like the Amazon folks themselves had a case of white guilt, which they sought to expiate by chiming in with the critical race theory agenda and canceling you.
That's exactly right.
Good grief.
I've been canceled a lot. This is not new to me.
I'm afraid that is true. I've been watching from afar, admiring your hard work. So again, thank you, and let me encourage everyone to go find and watch What Killed Michael Brown. You can get the trailer on YouTube right now. Very much worth seeking that out. Dr. Shelby Steele, thank you for joining us for our independent conversations. Will you come back some other time?
I'd be happy to, and I appreciate your invitation to come this time.
It's a pleasure to see you. Let me remind all of our friends that you can always turn to the Independent Institute for resources on this and other subjects. Go to independent.org and you can find your fill of antidotes to some of the problems that we've been talking about today. So with that, goodbye, Shelby Steele. Goodbye, everybody. Take care and come back again for Independent Conversations. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.